Beneath one of the most violent stretches of ocean on the planet, engineers are drilling a tunnel. Not a short one, not a simple one. A tunnel so long, so deep, and so expensive, it would rewrite the map of an entire continent. 2 countries, 1 sea, $20 billion, and a body of water that has swallowed ships whole. The storms here don't warn you before they arrive. The currents run so strong that divers can't operate at depth. The seabed shifts, the pressure builds, and yet, construction began anyway, because the alternative was worse. 2 nations, separated for centuries by geography, finally decided the sea was no longer allowed to stand between them. This is not a future project. This is not a proposal sitting on someone's desk. It is happening right now, and what they found when they started drilling, nobody was prepared for. The Fehmarn Belt, a narrow strip of sea sitting between Denmark and Germany, only 18 miles wide at its narrowest point. 18 miles. That sounds manageable, until you understand what those 18 miles actually contain. The Baltic and the North Sea collide here. 2 massive bodies of water grinding against each other, creating currents that change direction without warning, and storms that arrive faster than any forecast can track. Ships have been rerouted, delayed, damaged. Some never made it across at all. For decades, the only way to cross was a ferry, a slow, weather-dependent, commercially frustrating ferry. And every year, millions of trucks, trains, and passengers sat waiting on docks, burning fuel, burning time, because 18 miles of open water stood between them. The economic cost was staggering. Trade routes between Scandinavia and Central Europe were being choked by a stretch of sea that, on a map, looks almost like nothing. Denmark and Germany had talked about fixing this for years, decades, actually. Every time a plan emerged, the cost scared it back into a drawer. Then, in 2020, construction officially began. Not a bridge, not a longer ferry route, a tunnel. An immersed tube tunnel, the longest of its kind ever attempted, stretching 18 kilometers beneath the Fehmarn Belt. The engineering community called it extraordinary. Some called it the most complex underwater construction project in European history. But the men who actually went down to survey the seabed called it something else entirely. They called it unpredictable. And in tunnel engineering, unpredictable is the most dangerous word there is. The seabed beneath the Fehmarn Belt looks calm on a map. It is not calm. When geologists ran their initial surveys, they found something that stopped the room cold. The bottom wasn't solid rock. It wasn't even consistent. It was a shifting, layered mix of clay, sand, and glacial debris. Material deposited over thousands of years by retreating ice sheets. In some sections, the ground was softer than expected. In others, it was riddled with boulders, massive stones dragged down by glaciers and buried just deep enough to be invisible until a drill hit them. One senior geologist on the project described it as trying to build through a giant, unsorted gravel pit hiding underneath a violent sea. And that was just the ground. Above the construction zone, the weather had its own agenda. The Fehmarn Belt averages over 200 storm days per year. Not rough weather days, storm days. Conditions that halt marine operations, force equipment back to port, and compress already brutal construction schedule us into smaller and smaller windows. The engineers had planned for delays, but the delays came faster than the plans could absorb. Here's where the project made a decision that surprised almost everyone watching. Instead of building the tunnel underwater, piece by piece, in open water, they would build the tunnel segments on land, in a factory. An entirely custom-built factory, constructed specifically for this project, sitting right at the water's edge in Denmark. 90 massive concrete elements, each one longer than a football field, would be cast, sealed, floated out, and sunk into a pre-dug trench on the seabed. It sounded, on paper, like an elegant solution, but the trench still had to be dug through that unstable, boulder-filled, storm-battered seabed. And what the dredging crews found when they started cutting changed the timeline entirely. The dredging ships moved into position in the spring. Massive vessels, some of the largest in the world, equipped with cutting heads powerful enough to chew through compacted seabed material at industrial scale. They began carving the trench, 18 kilometers long, 42 meters wide, deep enough to bury a 4-story building beneath the seafloor. In the first weeks, progress was steady. Then the boulders started appearing, not small ones. Rocks the size of houses, dragged here by glaciers 10,000 years ago, and left sitting just beneath the surface of the seabed. The cutting equipment couldn't handle them. Specialized rock clearing vessels had to be brought in just to break apart and remove individual boulders before the dredgers could continue. It slowed everything down. But the boulders weren't even the worst part. Environmental agencies across Scandinavia had been watching this project from the moment construction was announced. The Fehmarn Belt is not just a shipping lane. It is one of the most ecologically sensitive marine corridors in northern Europe. Harbor porpoises migrate through it. Rare fish species breed in its shallower zones. The seabed, the very seabed they were now tearing open. Environmental groups had fought the project in court for years. Some of the most intense legal battles in Danish infrastructure history were fought specifically over this tunnel, and they lost. Construction proceeded, but the conditions attached to that approval were severe. Underwater noise limits, sediment monitoring, strict seasonal dredging windows, restrictions that forced crews to stop work entirely during certain biological migration periods. The construction schedule, already bleeding from the boulder delays, was now being carved up by environmental compliance windows. Every stoppage cost money. Every delay pushed the pressure deeper onto the men managing the next phase, the phase nobody had fully solved yet. Sinking 90 concrete elements into a moving, unstable, storm-swept trench without a single one shifting out of alignment. Each concrete element weighed around 73,000 tons. Let that settle for a moment. 73,000 tons, heavier than a fully loaded aircraft carrier. And the plan was to float each one out into open water, position it with millimeter precision above the trench, and slowly sink it onto the seabed in the middle of one of Europe's most unpredictable stretches. The factory in Erdbehaven had been running for months, casting elements, sealing them, testing them. Each one took weeks to produce, and once they were ready, there was no room for error on the water. The sinking operations required near-perfect weather windows, winds below a certain threshold, currents within a manageable range, visibility sufficient for the survey crews working underwater. In the Fehmarn Belt, those windows are rare. Sometimes they lasted 2 or 3 days, sometimes less. The marine coordinators would watch forecasts obsessively, waiting for the belt to offer them just enough calm to sink another element into place. And then came the moment that made engineers go quiet. During one of the early immersion operations, as an element was being guided down toward the trench, the current shifted, not dramatically, not violently, just enough. The element moved, a fraction of a degree off its intended alignment. On land, a fraction of a degree means nothing. 18 kilometers underwater, connecting two countries. A fraction of a degree is the difference between a sealed tunnel and a joint that leaks under pressure. The teams underwater worked for hours correcting it. They got it back into position. But every engineer on that project now understood something they hadn't fully felt before. The sea was not a passive obstacle. It was an active one, and there were still dozens of elements left to sink, each one carrying the same risk, each one depending on a belt of water that had already proven it plays by its own rules. The elements kept going in, one by one, week after week. Each operation a carefully controlled gamble against weather, current, and the slow accumulation of human fatigue. The teams developed a rhythm. Watch the forecast, wait for the window, move fast, sink clean, check alignment, and slowly, painfully slowly, the tunnel began taking shape beneath the Fehmarn Belt. But there was one final problem nobody had advertised publicly. The tunnel wasn't just crossing a sea. It was crossing a seismic boundary. The Fehmarn Belt sits along a geological fault line running through the Baltic region, not an active fault in the dramatic sense. No one was predicting earthquakes, but the ground here moves slowly, continuously, almost imperceptibly, enough that engineers had to design expansion joints into every single connection point, joints capable of absorbing ground movement without cracking the concrete or breaking the seals. Because a sealed tunnel beneath 18 miles of open sea that develops a crack doesn't flood slowly. The project is now expected to complete around 2029. When it opens, the crossing time between Denmark and Germany will drop from 45 minutes by ferry to just 10 minutes by train. A journey that once depended on weather, ferry schedules, and open water will become as routine as any other rail connection in Europe. Freight routes will shift, trade volumes will increase, the map of Northern European infrastructure will be permanently redrawn. But the Fehmarn Belt will still be out there, still storming, still shifting, still pressing down on 90 concrete elements buried in its floor. and the engineers who built it will spend the rest of their careers quietly hoping the joints hold. If you follow projects like this, the ones happening right now, beneath ocean, inside mountain, under cities most people will never think about, there's more where this came from.